I still remember the way my hands trembled when I read that message. "Don't come to my wedding, Mom. You'll embarrass me." 12 words. That's all it took to end 27 years of motherhood as I knew it. I read it again, thinking maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe his fiancée had borrowed his phone. But no, the words were sharp and clear, cold as the wind that crept through my kitchen window that morning. And beneath them, my son's name, Ryan. I never imagined the boy I once rocked to sleep, the boy whose forehead I kissed through fevers, could look at me and see shame instead of love. It felt like a quiet death, one that no one could see, but I felt spreading through me like frost. I sat down on the edge of my kitchen chair, my heart beating too loudly in the silence. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and the roses I'd cut from the garden yesterday. I'd been preparing, ironing his childhood shirt, finding old photos, choosing the necklace I'd wear to his wedding. I'd even set aside money for the gift, a little something for their honeymoon. It wasn't much, but it came from the years I'd saved working double shifts at the diner, sewing at night, skipping the things I wanted so he could have everything. And now, suddenly, I wasn't wanted at all. But maybe I should start from the beginning, before the silence, before the sting. 'Cause heartbreak rarely arrives in a single moment. Builds quietly, like dust gathering in corners, unnoticed until it dulls everything you love. When Ryan was little, he was soft-spoken but full of light. He loved stories, especially the ones about heroes and second chances. Every night after I finished cleaning the kitchen, he'd crawl onto my lap with his blanket, and I'd read to him until his breathing softened. Sometimes I'd whisper that I wanted him to grow into a good man, kind, humble, loyal. He'd always smile and say, "Like you, Mom." Those words used to mean everything. We never had much. His father left when Ryan was 9, and the house became too quiet after that. I filled the silence with work, 2 jobs, endless bills, and the steady rhythm of survival. Till I made sure Ryan never felt poor. His lunches were always packed, his shoes never had holes, and every birthday I baked his favorite vanilla cake with caramel frosting. I gave him what I never had, love without limits, faith without question. When he went to college, I sold my wedding ring to help cover his tuition deposit. It was the only piece of gold I owned, but I told myself it was worth it. He called me every Sunday those first 2 years. Told me about classes, about a girl he liked. I could hear the excitement in his voice, the sound of his world growing. But then, slowly, the calls grew shorter. Then fewer. Then stopped. When he came home for holidays, he seemed different. Polished, distant, like someone practicing to forget where they came from. He started talking about people who mattered, and I wasn't one of them anymore. I noticed the changes in small ways, the way he looked at my hands when I reached for him, the way he sighed when I mispronounced something he'd learned. His new life didn't have space for the woman who once walked barefoot across icy floors just to keep him warm. But mothers, real mothers, see everything and say nothing. So I smiled, kept cooking his favorite meals, and waited for the day he'd remember who he was. Then came her. Her name was Emily, the fiancée. I'd seen her once in a photograph on his phone. Pretty, poised, eyes like polished glass. She came from a different world, the kind that measured worth by last names and property lines. When Ryan introduced us briefly last Christmas, she shook my hand the way one might handle something fragile. Her perfume filled the room, expensive and overdone. I remember thinking it smelled like something that tried too hard to hide what was underneath. They didn't stay long that night. Ryan said they had a dinner to attend, something formal. I'd made his favorite roast. It grew cold on the table after they left. Till I told myself this was love. That maybe he'd finally found happiness, and that was all a mother should want. So I started planning for the wedding, quietly, carefully. I bought a soft blue dress, ironed every pleat, and placed it in my closet. I even practiced pinning up my hair, just like I used to when his father was still around. I thought maybe on that day, he'd see me again, not as the mother who scrubbed floors, but as a woman who'd given everything so he could stand tall. But then that text. that cruel, ordinary little text. I remember my thumb hovering over the screen. My mind kept whispering no. Not my Ryan. Not after everything. But there it was. Real. Undeniable. I read it a dozen times until the words blurred. Don't come to my wedding, Mom. You'll embarrass me. It wasn't just rejection, it was erasure. He didn't just uninvite me. He erased the mother who built the foundation he now stood on. That night I didn't cry. Not yet. I just sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the old clock ticking above the sink. The house felt smaller, almost hollow. I thought of the years I'd spent alone, the nights I skipped dinner so he could have a full plate, the letters I'd written when I missed him too much to sleep. And slowly a thought settled in, soft but sharp enough to hurt. Maybe I hadn't raised a good man after all. Maybe I'd raised someone who learned how to take love but never give it back. But heartbreak is a quiet teacher. And as I sat there in that silence, I made a promise to myself, not out of anger but out of dignity. If my son was ashamed of where he came from, then I'd remind him in my own way that a mother's love isn't disposable. He thought he could erase me from his life like a line from a text message. But I had something stronger than his pride. I had patience. And patience, when laced with pain, can become a weapon far sharper than revenge. That night, for the first time in years, I turned off the porch light, the one I always kept on for him. The house sank into darkness. And I decided, if my presence embarrassed him, then maybe my absence would teach him everything he'd forgotten. Grief has a strange rhythm when it comes from the living. You can't bury it, can't say goodbye to it. It lingers, breathing beside you, whispering what you've lost each time you exhale. After that message, I didn't respond. I told myself I needed time to think, but really, I was just trying to feel the ground again beneath me. It's strange how one text can tilt your entire world. The same kitchen where I'd once danced barefoot while he laughed in his high chair suddenly felt like a stage after the play was over, the lights still on but no one left watching. 4 days I went through the motions. Fed the cat. Watered the garden. Folded clothes that would never be worn for that wedding. There's a kind of numbness that settles in after heartbreak. Not loud, not wild, just heavy. Like a wet blanket laid over every small joy. But in the stillness, you start to see things differently. The same silence that hurts you also begins to teach you. I realized I had spent my entire life giving, my time, my youth, my warmth, and in return I'd been given guilt. I'd been told to shrink so others could shine. Even my son, the one I'd held through every fever, every heartbreak, had learned to see me as something to outgrow. And so I began to pay attention, not to him but to myself. I noticed how the morning light hit the kitchen window just right when I brewed my coffee. I noticed the sound of the wind chime outside, the one Ryan made when he was 7, still catching the wind like a memory. I noticed that I hadn't smiled in months, not a real one. I used to think motherhood was about sacrifice. Now I was starting to wonder if it was also about forgetting who you are. The days passed. I heard nothing from him. No apology. No explanation. Just silence, long, deliberate silence. Until one afternoon, while checking the mailbox, I saw an envelope with a printed label. Not his handwriting, not his touch. It was an invitation. It wasn't addressed to me, of course. But the return address was his, their new home. The irony was bitter and exquisite. My son had ordered printed invitations to the wedding he'd forbidden me to attend. And somehow one had found its way to my house, maybe by mistake, maybe by fate. I opened it carefully. Inside was a thick card embossed in gold, the kind of paper that smells like perfume and money. You are cordially invited to celebrate the marriage of Ryan Alexander and Emily Grace. My son had dropped my name, no middle name, no family ties. Just Ryan Alexander. Clean. Polished. New. I sat on the porch for a long time after that, staring at the invitation, letting the wind turn its corners. There's something about seeing your own child's future written down in ink, and realizing you're not part of it. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine for the first time in years. I sat by the window and thought about all the things I'd done to build his life, every meal, every bill, every scraped knee I'd kissed. I thought about the money I'd saved over the years for him. Always for him. The house, the savings, even the old beach cottage his father and I had bought before things fell apart. Ryan had always assumed it would be his one day. I never said otherwise. But something inside me was changing. Quiet sadness that had once filled me was beginning to cool into something else, clarity. I wasn't angry. Anger burns fast and disappears. This was deeper, slower, like water wearing down stone. I started going through old boxes, the ones in the attic filled with Ryan's childhood things. His drawings, his report cards, his first pair of shoes. It felt like sorting through pieces of someone who no longer existed. And as I folded each memory, I realized I was saying goodbye, not to my son, but to the illusion that love alone could save a relationship. One night, unable to sleep, I scrolled through my phone and saw photos from the engagement party. They'd been posted publicly, smiling faces, crystal glasses, golden lights. I looked at Ryan's expression, proud, confident, polished. And Emily beside him, her hand on his arm, looking at him like he was made of success. There was no trace of the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard. No hint of the child who once cried because I'd hurt my hand on a sewing needle. It was like watching a stranger wearing his face. And that's when I noticed something else, a caption. Grateful for the family we've chosen. The words hit me harder than the text ever did. Because it wasn't just that I wasn't invited. I'd been replaced. The next morning, I walked through my house as if seeing it for the first time. The walls were old, yes, but they'd held my laughter, my tears, my sacrifices. The garden still bloomed where I'd planted roses for Ryan when he was 6, the same bushes he used to hide behind, pretending to be an explorer. Everything in that home was built on love. And love, when forgotten, deserves release. So I started making quiet plans. Small, invisible steps that no one would notice at first. I checked the property files, the accounts, the insurance. I reread my will, the one that still named Ryan as sole beneficiary. Each signature I'd once written in love now looked like a chain. The truth is, revenge doesn't always look like fire. Sometimes it looks like a slow, deliberate undoing, a mother deciding that her legacy no longer belongs to the ungrateful. I didn't need to confront him. I didn't need to beg or explain. I just needed to act, quietly, cleanly, like closing a door that should have been locked years ago. As I began the process of changing documents, transferring assets, and planning the sale of the old cottage, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: control. The kind that doesn't shout or demand. Kind that simply knows. I realized that motherhood had made me powerful, not because of what I'd given, but because of what I could take back. Each paper I signed felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Each form submitted was a quiet declaration: you can't be ashamed of me and still profit from me. Weeks passed and I heard nothing from Ryan. But I didn't need to. Because I'd already set in motion the one lesson he'd never forget, that every empire built on denial eventually crumbles, especially when it forgets the hands that built its foundation. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I found myself standing in the garden, watching the last light touch the roses. They'd grown wild lately, too many thorns, too few petals. But somehow they were still beautiful. And in that fading gold, I understood something simple yet profound. Even the things that hurt us most can still bloom if we let them. So I turned off my phone, closed the door, and went to bed with a calm heart. Because I knew the silence that had once broken me was now my greatest weapon. And soon he would feel its echo. The morning of the wedding came wrapped in gold and tension. The sun over Santa Barbara glowed too perfectly, like it was mocking her pain. Inside her small kitchen, Margaret sat with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The radio hummed softly, playing the same love songs that once filled her house when Thomas was just a boy. But today her house was silent, stripped of laughter, of family, of the illusion that she still belonged. She had received no invitation, no directions. Only that text. "Don't come to my wedding, Mom." You'll embarrass me. But she wasn't planning to show up uninvited. She had something much colder in mind. The church guests arrived in pastel dresses and tailored suits. Thomas looked every bit the successful young man he had become, charming, well-dressed, proud. Beside him, Rachel beamed, radiant and naive, her white gown like a symbol of everything Margaret wasn't allowed to be, perfect, wanted, loved. They thought Margaret was home, hurt and humiliated. They didn't know what she'd already done. 2 weeks earlier, when the wedding invitations were printed, Margaret had quietly made a phone call. She had contacted the property lawyer who'd helped her late husband set up their family's trust, the same trust that still technically owned half of the vineyard Thomas bragged about in every interview and toast. She never transferred that share to him. He just assumed she would because Mom would never do something like that. But she did. She had changed the trust. She'd sold her share of the vineyard quietly, legally, and cleanly to one of Thomas's oldest business rivals. So while Thomas and Rachel danced and toasted under the chandeliers that night, the new owner's lawyers were already preparing the paperwork. The vineyard Thomas used as the backdrop for his perfect life, the one he told everyone he built from nothing, would no longer be his by morning. But Margaret didn't want him to lose only property. She wanted him to lose certainty. Because that was what he took from her, the certainty of being loved by her own child. So while guests laughed and clinked glasses, Margaret sat quietly in her car across the street. The church doors opened, spilling music and laughter into the evening air. She could see her son twirl his bride, a grin on his face that used to be hers, back when he was small enough to hold her hand without shame. She could have walked away. She could have let time do the punishing. But pain like hers needed to be seen. That's when she pulled out her phone and posted a message on Facebook, public, direct, and carefully worded. My son, Thomas, asked me not to come to his wedding because I'd embarrass him. So I respected his wish. But before you toast to his family-built vineyard, you should know he no longer owns it. Congratulations to the new owner. Thomas, honey, maybe next time you'll remember where your roots came from. She hit post. Within minutes, the comments started. Then the shares. Then the phone calls. By the time Thomas and Rachel finished their first dance, half the guests' phones were buzzing. Whispers spread across the tables. Rachel's father frowned at his screen. Thomas's smile began to fade. Back in her car, Margaret finally smiled, not in cruelty but in peace. 4 years she had lived quietly, sacrificing her dignity to protect her son's ego. But not today. Today she chose herself. And as she drove away, the bells of the church echoed behind her, not like a wedding but like an ending. That night, Thomas called. 23 missed calls. 9 voicemails, each more desperate than the last. By the 10th, his voice cracked. Mom, please, you don't understand. Can we talk? Margaret didn't answer. She only texted back. You said I'd embarrass you, Thomas. I just wanted to prove you were right. That single message ended whatever was left between them. And yet, as she set down her phone, she felt something she hadn't in years, silence that didn't hurt. 'Cause sometimes revenge isn't about destruction. It's about release. And that night, under the pale glow of the streetlight, Margaret finally set herself free. Morning broke with headlines. The sun hadn't even burned through the fog before the story spread. First through whispers, then through local business news, and by noon through social media chaos. Vineyard ownership transfer sparks drama at local wedding. Mother outs son's secret at his own wedding reception. Margaret didn't have to read the articles. She already knew what they would say because for once she had written the ending. But as she sat in her small living room that morning, wrapped in a knitted shawl her husband once gave her, she couldn't help but feel something unexpected, emptiness. Not guilt, not triumph, just silence. For 30 years she had built her life around loving her son. Her meals, her prayers, her hopes, all shaped around his happiness. And now that bond was gone. Severed not by her revenge, but by his words. At the other end of town, Thomas's world was unraveling. His phone buzzed nonstop, reporters, investors, even old college friends wanting to know if it was true. Rachel sat on the edge of their honeymoon suite's bed, still in her wedding dress, tears streaking through her makeup. "Why didn't you tell me your mom still owned half the vineyard?" she whispered. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, his voice cracking. "Because I thought it didn't matter anymore. She was supposed to transfer it. She said she would." "She didn't," Rachel said coldly, her eyes distant. "She sold it." Thomas's pride, the same pride that made him text those 7 words, "Don't come to my wedding, Mom," was the same pride now burning his world down. For the first time in years, he realized something horrifying. He didn't know his mother anymore. He had treated her like a shadow, but she'd turned out to be a storm. The lawyers confirmed it. The sale was final. Legal. Untouchable. The rival now owned controlling interest. His employees were nervous. His partners wanted answers. By the 3rd day, Rachel left their honeymoon early, claiming she needed space. By the 5th, Thomas's board voted to freeze his access to company funds. The vineyard that once symbolized his ambition now symbolized his arrogance. Meanwhile, Margaret went about her days quietly. She bought groceries, fed the neighbor's cat, watered her small patch of roses. But behind that calm routine was something else, reflection. Because even though she had gotten her revenge, a mother's heart never truly hardens completely. That night, she still looked at the framed photo on her dresser. Thomas at 12 years old, holding a baseball glove, his smile so wide it could have lit the whole world. She whispered to that boy sometimes. "I wish I could have kept you small," she'd say softly. "Before pride took you away." 2 weeks later, there was a knock at her door. When she opened it, Thomas stood there. He looked nothing like the confident man from the wedding. His suit was wrinkled, his face pale, his eyes hollow. "Mom," he said quietly. Margaret didn't move. He swallowed. "Can I come in?" For a long, heavy moment, she said nothing. Then she stepped aside. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd once done his homework, where she'd served him soup when he was sick, where he'd told her about his first crush. Now there was only silence. "I lost everything," he said finally. "The vineyard, Rachel, even my reputation. I didn't think you'd ever do something like that." Margaret looked at him, not angry, not smug, just tired. "Thomas," she said softly, "I didn't do it to ruin you. I did it because you already ruined what mattered most, us." He stared at her. She continued, her voice trembling but steady. "You made me believe that I was something to be ashamed of, that my love was an embarrassment, that my presence was unwanted. Do you know what that does to a mother?" He opened his mouth to speak, but she held up her hand. "I stayed quiet for too long, Thomas. I let you walk over me because I thought that's what good mothers do. But being a good mother doesn't mean being invisible." He lowered his gaze, tears slipping down his cheeks. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Margaret's voice softened, but her eyes stayed sharp. "I believe you. But sorry doesn't always fix things. Sometimes it just arrives too late." He nodded slowly, wiping his face. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. I didn't think losing you would hurt this much." Margaret took a deep breath. "Now you know how I felt for years." When he left, the sun was setting behind the hills, the same hills where their vineyard once stretched wide and golden. He turned once on the driveway, maybe expecting her to wave, to call him back. But she didn't. She watched him go, her heart heavy but free. Because this was her truth. Sometimes a parent's love is not endless. It's deep, it's forgiving, but it has limits. And when those limits are crossed, love transforms into something else, wisdom, maybe. Or strength. Or survival. That night, she brewed tea, opened her window, and let the cool breeze wash over her. On the table beside her sat a small wooden box, inside a check from the vineyard sale. Enough to move to the coast, start fresh, maybe even buy a small place near the ocean she'd always dreamed of. She smiled faintly. "My son taught me pride," she whispered. "But I taught him consequence." 2 months later, Thomas's rival reached out to Margaret with an offer to stay on as an advisor. She accepted. Not out of spite. Out of purpose. Because she realized she didn't need revenge anymore. She needed rebirth. In the final scene of her story, Margaret stood on the vineyard porch, her hair silver against the sunset, the ocean wind brushing her face. Her phone buzzed once more, a message from Thomas. "Mom, I'm proud of you." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Because some lessons aren't answered with words, only with silence, peace, and distance earned through pain. Months passed, and the seasons softened the edges of their story. Summer gave way to autumn, and the vineyard, once the pulse of Thomas's ambition, now ripened under new ownership. The workers still came and went, their laughter drifting through the vines, but the energy had changed. There was calm now, not control. Growth, not greed. Margaret had long since moved to the coast. Her small house overlooked the ocean, not grand, not luxurious, but filled with light. Each morning, she opened her curtains to watch the horizon melt into gold. She'd brew tea in her favorite porcelain cup, the one with a small chip on the rim, and sit by the window listening to gulls cry over the waves. For the first time in her life, she wasn't living for someone else. She was simply living. But peace has a strange way of stirring the heart. Some days she'd still think of Thomas, not with bitterness but with a kind of quiet ache. Kind that comes from knowing love had existed, even if it didn't survive intact. Meanwhile, Thomas was learning the language of loss. After the vineyard sale, after Rachel left, after the noise faded and people stopped caring, he began to face the silence he'd always avoided. It was in that silence that he realized how much of his success had been built on his mother's sacrifices. The long nights she'd stayed up doing the accounting for his first venture. The savings she'd poured into the vineyard when the bank refused to lend. The meals she'd made when he was too busy to eat. He'd taken it all and called it independence. Now, alone in a small rented apartment, he replayed every word he'd sent her that day. "Don't come to my wedding, Mom, you'll embarrass me." He had meant it in anger, but she had received it as truth. And truth, once spoken, can't be unsaid. One evening, a plain brown envelope arrived at his door. No return address, no markings, just his name written in her careful handwriting. For a moment he froze. His heart stumbled in his chest. He tore it open slowly, as though afraid it might crumble in his hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. Her writing filled the page, graceful, steady, deliberate. "My dear Thomas, I don't know where this letter will find you, perhaps in regret, perhaps in reflection. But wherever you are, I hope you've learned that love is not meant to humiliate, nor to be earned. It simply is, until it's bruised enough times to retreat for its own survival. When you told me I would embarrass you, I realized something I'd been too afraid to face. I had raised you to be strong but not gentle, ambitious but not grateful. You thought success made you untouchable, but it only made you blind. I don't hate you, Thomas. I never could. I simply love you from far away now, from a place where I am no longer small or silent. And maybe in time that distance will teach us both something worth more than pride. There is a key inside this envelope. It opens a box at the old vineyard, under the oak tree near the fence where you used to play. Inside, you'll find something that once belonged to your father. He believed you'd need it someday when you learned that love is not measured by control but by respect. Take care of yourself, my son. Not your business. Not your name. Yourself. Mom. The letter trembled in his hands. He didn't cry right away. He just sat there, staring at the handwriting, tracing the ink with his thumb, hearing her voice between the lines. That night, he drove to the vineyard. The gates were closed, the workers gone. The air was cool, the sky scattered with stars. He found the old oak tree easily. Its roots were deep, its bark familiar. He remembered climbing it as a boy, shouting for her to watch him, and she always had. At its base was a small, weathered box. Rusted lock. Cracked wood. He used the key. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, his father's journal, and a photograph. The photo showed a young Thomas between his parents, all three smiling, sunlight pouring over them like forgiveness. He opened the first page of the journal. It began with his father's handwriting. If my boy ever loses his way, remind him that love and respect must grow together or neither will survive. Thomas sat there for hours, the waves of memory rolling through him. He realized then that his mother hadn't wanted revenge. She had wanted him to see her, to see himself, to see what he'd become. And in that quiet vineyard night, he finally did. Months later, Margaret received a letter in return. Short, simple, handwritten. Mom, I found the box. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I didn't deserve it. I've started again, smaller, humbler, but better. You were never an embarrassment. You were the lesson. She smiled softly as she read it, folded it neatly, and placed it in her journal between 2 pages of pressed lavender. Then she walked outside to her porch, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The sea murmured below, the air thick with salt and memory. She looked out over the horizon, the same horizon her son might be watching from somewhere inland, and for the first time in years her heart felt both full and light. 'Cause love, when it survives the storm, doesn't need to be loud. Just needs to be true. She whispered into the wind as if sending her words across the miles. You were never the mistake, Thomas. You were just my greatest lesson. And the wind carried it, out to sea, out to time, out to peace. Final line. Sometimes the people who break our hearts aren't villains, they're mirrors. And when the reflection finally changes, that's when healing begins. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks, so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.